In 1907, the U.S. economy was falling apart. Banks were shutting down. Panic was everywhere. There was no central bank, no backup plan. So J.P. Morgan called the country's top bankers into his private library and locked the doors. They wouldn't leave until they found a way to stop the collapse. By morning, the panic had ended. But what happened in that room didn't just solve a crisis. It set the foundation for a debt-based system that now shapes your entire financial life. A system that doesn't eliminate debt, it expands it. Governments borrow just to stay afloat. Interest never stops. And the burden moves downhill to taxpayers, to workers, to you. Today, the world owes over $315 trillion, and most of that debt was never meant to be paid back. In the next 10 minutes, you'll see how that decision in 1907 didn't just stabilize Wall Street. It created a financial system that now controls your paycheck, your savings, and your future. To understand why J.P. Morgan's secret meeting became the turning point that locked the world into a permanent debt system, you have to look at the world he stepped into. Because Morgan didn't create the idea of debt becoming the backbone of economies. That groundwork had already been laid, building slowly and quietly over centuries. By the time Morgan shut the doors of his library, the architecture was complete. All he did was turn it on. Long before the 1907 crisis, the foundations of the modern debt system were already being built by three men in three different centuries, each one adding a piece that made permanent global debt not just possible, but inevitable. It began in 1694. William Patterson proposed a loan that the government would never repay. England, desperate to fund its war with France, borrowed £1.2 million and agreed to pay interest on it forever. That's about $300 million in today's money. To manage this, Patterson helped create the Bank of England, an institution designed not to eliminate debt, but to maintain it. For the first time, a government could fund itself indefinitely through borrowing. A century later, Nathan Rothschild expanded that model. He turned national debt into an international network, using a cross-border banking system that created the first real secondary market for sovereign bonds. Debt became mobile. Now, a British bond might sit in a French bank, fund a German project, and be backed by Austrian assets. And if a single country even hinted at default, it was a contagion, a web no country could leave without tearing down the structure around it. Then, in the 1980s, Paul Volcker tightened that web. By raising U.S. interest rates to historic highs, he triggered crisis across nations carrying dollar-dominated loans. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina couldn't even pay the interest. But instead of letting them default, the IMF created a new rule: restructure the debt, never forgive it. In return, nations were forced to slash public spending, sell state assets, and give up control of their own economies. For the first time, debt was now not just permanent but inescapable. By the time Morgan entered the story, the system of permanent and inescapable debt was already built. But in 1907, that structure cracked. Banks collapsed overnight. Depositors lined up outside in panic, desperate to withdraw their savings before everything vanished. There was no central bank or safety net. For a moment, it seemed the entire U.S. financial system was ready to collapse. And that's when the country learned a brutal truth. The most powerful figure in America's economy wasn't the president. It was J.P. Morgan. He wasn't elected or held public office, but he was the only man left who had the power and the capital to stop the panic. So, he summoned the top bankers and businessmen in New York to his private library. Then, he locked the doors. No one would leave until they had a plan to stop the collapse. Morgan decided who would survive, which banks would merge, which would fail, and how much money each man at the table would contribute to the rescue. And they obeyed him. because they had no choice. Outside, the public had no idea what was happening. All they knew was that the panic stopped. Banks reopened. Markets stabilized. The system had been saved. But after that night, one thing became undeniable. The U.S. economy depended on one man to prevent collapse. And if one man could save the system, one man could shape it. Morgan's intervention in 1907 didn't just stop a collapse. It exposed a dangerous truth. The American economy was too fragile to stand on its own. It had survived only because one man had enough power to force a solution. That reality terrified everyone. The public, the government, even Morgan himself realized the system couldn't rely on a private rescuer again. Instead of fixing the root causes, they institutionalized the rescue mechanism. And in doing so, they embedded debt into the core of the financial system. In 1910, 3 years after the crisis, a small group of Morgan's closest allies met secretly on Jekyll Island. Bankers, senators, and Wall Street insiders. Their goal was clear: replicate what Morgan had done in his library, but replace the man with a permanent institution. They drafted the blueprint for what they called the Federal Reserve System. 12 regional banks, a governing board, checks and balances. But real power sat behind the curtain. The New York Fed, controlled by Wall Street. In 1913, Morgan's emergency intervention became law. The new Fed could inject liquidity, buy government debt, and backstop banks. But with one ability Morgan never had, the Fed could buy government bonds with money it created out of nothing. That changed everything, because now the U.S. government had a guaranteed buyer for its debt. Debt wasn't temporary anymore. It became the system's fuel, permanent and expanding, forever. Once the Federal Reserve began operating, the financial system changed in a way the public couldn't see. Debt stopped being a temporary tool and became the engine of the economy. Before the Fed, government borrowing had limits. Investors had to buy the bonds, and credit was finite. After the Fed, those limits disappeared. If investors didn't step in, the Fed would. Each purchase created new money. Each round of borrowing expanded the system. More debt meant more liquidity. More liquidity meant more spending. But every bond carried interest, paid by taxpayers. That's how a $38 trillion debt becomes manageable. Today, the U.S. spends nearly $1 trillion a year just on interest, and that money flows straight into institutions, asset managers, and banks. And the model didn't stay in America. Japan owes $9 trillion. Europe owes over $14 trillion. China is weighed down by domestic debt. Globally, the figure has exploded past $315 trillion. But the part no one tells you: in a system where money is created through borrowing, paying down debt doesn't fix the problem. It destroys the money supply. Repaying the principal erases the very dollars the loan created. So instead of repaying, governments roll it over, issue new debt, borrow more, expand balance sheets, keep the machine running. This is the world Morgan helped activate. They're absorbed by expanding liabilities. But this isn't just about governments and banks and charts, because when the machine runs hot, the pressure doesn't stay at the top, and the impact doesn't land on institutions, it lands on you. When governments borrow endlessly, someone funds the interest. Not politicians, not central banks, taxpayers. It shows up in rising taxes, not for better services, but to service liabilities. It shows up in inflation, a structural feature of the system. As the money supply expands, the value of each dollar erodes. Wages stagnate. Prices rise. Savings lose ground. You feel it in the quiet squeeze of everyday life. The paycheck that doesn't stretch. Rent rising faster than income. The pressure to work more just to stay afloat. Most people think they're falling behind because of bad choices. But the truth is, the system is designed to push them there. A debt-based system needs constant revenue. And the most reliable source is the working public. Everyone who earns, spends, saves, borrows, feeds the system. That's why global debt sits at $315 trillion. Why no country can pay it off. Patterson created permanent debt. Rothschild made it global. Morgan proved it needed constant credit to survive. Volcker showed nations would be forced to borrow forever, even when they can't repay. Today, money enters the system through borrowing. Borrowing creates money. Repayment destroys it. If every nation paid off its debt, the global money supply, salaries, savings, investments would collapse. That's why governments don't eliminate debt. They can't. Global debt now exceeds $315 trillion. Interest rises. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Wages fall behind. The system isn't malfunctioning. It expands debt with every crisis, bailout, and solution. That's why taxes rise, prices climb, and savings lose value. The system keeps everyone, governments, institutions, and ordinary people in perpetual debt. Once you see how the system really works, how it feeds on every crisis, every bailout, and every paycheck, you can't unsee it. The failure was never yours. It was the system's design. If this helped you see the system more clearly, if you finally understand why debt keeps growing, why money feels tighter, and why no one in power ever talks about real solutions, then there's more you need to know. Because this machine runs deeper than just debt. So if you want to understand how it all fits together, subscribe. This is just the beginning.